sitting idle waiting for something that's going to occur in the future. Mr. Speaker, we have a new cancer drug fund here in Nova Scotia. An additional $10 million was put into that fund this year, Mr. Speaker, and this ensures that cancer patients, for example, who require drugs and intravenous therapies are able to access these drugs, Mr. Speaker. So we will continue to work on the national level while delivering better health care to Nova Scotians here at home, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important issue, as we both agreed, not only for people with cancer, but for people with other illnesses that require extremely expensive drugs, who are also making those very difficult decisions, if not impossible decisions. Mr. Speaker, last week when I asked a question in the House, the minister said she's ready to go toe-to-toe with me on, at any time about the record of the government. I guess what I'd like to see is that she's ready to go toe-to-toe with the federal government, bringing these issues that the provinces need the support of a national program to take on the costs that we need to look after the people in our own provinces. So my question to the minister has she written to her counterparts requesting the agenda item be put forward at the next meeting of the health ministers? Will she revise the work that was already underway in 2004 of the working group on catastrophic drug coverage? And is she ready to show the leadership and go toe-to-toe with the federal government? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think most members of this House know I'm quite capable of going toe-to-toe with anyone.
The Honourable PC Leader in the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question will be to the Minister of Education. The O'Neill report on post-secondary education has the potential to drastically alter Nova Scotia's university system. Amongst main recommendations are the removal of the tuition caps, consolidation of administrative and program offerings, and changing funding formulas. So my question to the Minister, in the face of higher tuition rates related to the O'Neill report recommendations, does your government, as we did, still maintain a commitment to Nova Scotia's long-held goal of tuition rates reaching the national average?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, Dr. O'Neill identified a number of issues and decision points that need to be made as we try to both balance or live within our means, but also to strengthen and protect our post-secondary education system into the future. And we certainly are looking at all aspects of challenges to students. I've met with a number of student associations and groups, and they're very concerned about tuition fees, but they're also concerned about what assistance is going to be available. And I'm very proud to say that the Premier has committed to taking a very close look, a review of student assistance. It appears that under previous governments it has become one of the weakest packages in Canada, and we recognize that, and we've had good advice that it's something that we need to look at. So we'll be looking at those issues. Thank you.
The Honourable PC Leader in the House on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Dr. O'Neill suggests that over the next 20 years, the population of 17 to 29-year-olds in Nova Scotia is expected to decline by nearly 25%. This, combined with the continued uncertainty over the direction of tuition rates, will have a major impact on enrollment numbers, which have already been expected to decline over the medium to long term. So my question to the Minister, what is your government doing to combat the problem of dropping enrollments at Nova Scotia's universities?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, obviously the government has a role and a very strong interest in the students who come to take programs at our 11 degree granting institutions in this province. But certainly the primary responsibility for student recruitment lies with those institutions themselves. And they have a very aggressive, sophisticated, effective recruitment policy, both institutionally and in a collaborative sense. They understand the challenge. I've met with the university presidents and a number of the Board of Governor chairs, and they're all working very, very hard to ensure that student enrollment stays as strong and healthy as possible. Also, from the workforce development side, I want to say that I think there will be additional opportunities for older Nova Scotians to be able to return to school and strengthen their skills in learning. Thank you.
The Honourable PC Leader in the House on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Dr. O'Neill's very first recommendation in his report on post-secondary education says, and I quote, allow tuition fees to increase, both as partial offsets to the impact of fiscal restraint and on equity grounds, end quote. This would include anything, Mr. Speaker, from capping rates of increase to complete deregulation. And Mr. Speaker, really what ends up happening here is that as prices go up, tuition goes up, the enrollment will continue to go down, compounded by the issue of dropping enrollment. My final supplementary, how does this minister reconcile dropping enrollments for Nova Scotia's universities with increasing tuition rates as recommended by Dr. Tim O'Neill?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we certainly value the research and analysis and recommendations coming from Dr. O'Neill, we're going to use that information, that report and recommendations, as one piece of the information that government considers as it moves forward in collaboration with our post-secondary system. Certainly we're getting information from other sources, and as a responsible government would do, we're going to take all those different aspects into consideration and make the best possible decisions for the youth of this province and for the economy of this province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've been hearing about issues in residences for persons with developmental disabilities where residents are harming other residents and staff. I commend the Minister for investigating incidents in Truro, I really do, but she should not have been surprised by them. These incidents have been occurring for quite some time. A year ago, the Minister told the Chronicle Herald that she was, quote, shocked by the abuse at these facilities. My question to the Minister of Community Services, 1 year later, are you still shocked by this abuse?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. What the honourable member needs to understand is that the recent incidents were an incident where you have residential abuse to staff abuse, and that's quite different than the other abuse that we were dealing with last year, because it was residents to residents and staff to residents. So it is a different type of abuse, and you have to understand the complexity of the individuals that are in the residential facilities and how the difficulties is within that facility to be a staff person. And so therefore that's why it's very important when I am made aware of the situation that I go forth to look into that and gather as much information as possible to ensure that there's safety for everybody, whether it's a staff individual or a resident. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Abuse is abuse, and regardless of whether it's staff or residents, it's still abuse, and that's what we have to be concerned with. Mr. Speaker, we have to prevent abuse at these facilities, period. An investigation into past incidents is not enough. A problem exists when you mix individuals requiring high levels of care with others who may be harmed. My question to the Minister of Community Services, what is your policy to ensure facilities handle individuals requiring high levels of care appropriately?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Again for the question, because I understand and I feel the same way as you, that abuse is abuse. I think the Honourable needs to know is the fact that what we're dealing with is the history of legislation, and we did go forth and we did make changes in that legislation, but the complexity is because of the fact that as a government we support the facilities with funding. However, those facilities are owned by the municipalities, and the board of directors are made up as with municipal appointees, which are usually municipal councillors. And so they actually run the facilities, and we're the funders. So, but what we do, because of the fact that abuse is abuse, is as soon as there's a situation or even beforehand, we do a lot of training between our staff and our government officials to go into those facilities and to help them with the process and work very closely with the executive director and the board of directors. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would agree that those changes were good, but they were reactive. And what I think we need here to protect staff and clients is a more proactive approach. Mr. Speaker, a resident at the Churro facility under investigation has been abused by another resident multiple times. The resident responsible for the abuse was deemed high risk, but yet nothing has changed. Recently, there was another case of abuse between these same two residents, resulting in the victim sustaining a concussion. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Community Services. Other than just investigating, what is the Minister going to do to ensure these incidents stop?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you once again for the question. The key, we have been proactive. As I mentioned, that the nature of the structure that was developed years ago, and the municipalities actually own the facilities, we do not have the legal right to go in and tell them how the facilities are run. We're there as a support. It is a difficult situation because of how the structure is there. So therefore, the other avenue that I take as a minister is that I bring together the sector members, the operators of the facilities, and talk with them, and we're working in a restorative approach in order to work towards how can we resolve and how can we make a better place for the residents and how can we make a better place for the staff. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, according to a recent report on the university system in Nova Scotia, 32% of students attending Nova Scotia universities were from out of province. This translated into over 13,000 students during the 08-09 school year. These young men and women have a major impact on the Nova Scotia economy, yet the O'Neill report threatens to put this in jeopardy. Higher tuition and uncertainty surrounding the direction of rates resulting from implementation of this report would drive out-of-province students to other areas to pursue their education. My question to the Minister, has your department accounted for the significant economic impact of driving out-of-province students to other provinces and countries due to the O'Neill-related tuition hikes, and if so, what is that number?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I can certainly make it available. And in no way are we going to allow that situation to evolve to that point. I mean, we recognize as a government the value that having out-of-province and international students in our province brings, because it not only enriches the education of their fellow classmates, but it also enriches the institution and the communities that they live and work and play in. And quite frankly, I think it's about 22% of out-of-province and international students who choose to remain here in Nova Scotia. So it's a very effective immigration policy, and it's one that we value, and it's one that will ensure continues. Thank you.
The honourable member for Hants West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The direct economic impact of universities in Nova Scotia is over $1 billion. Therefore, all the potential effects of this report must be weighed very carefully before such drastic decisions are made. Otherwise, the impacts could be disastrous. My first supplementary to the minister: what is this minister's plan to retain these important out-of-province students in the face of higher tuition pressures here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, I think the very reputation and quality programming and excellent reputation of the staff, the faculty and instructors is what's going to recruit them to this province and keep them in this province. And certainly the universities have had an excellent track record of attracting out-of-province and international students, and there's nothing to indicate that's going to change in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Hants West on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what's striking about this report is how little it does to address the need for enrollment increases at all in Nova Scotia universities. My final supplementary to the minister: how do you expect to retain, let alone grow, the university student population here in Nova Scotia when the threat of drastic tuition hikes loom large in the mind of our overburdened students now?
The honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased, quite frankly, that the presidents and Board of Governors and staff and students of the universities are not taking the same gloom and doom view of the future of post-secondary education in this province. They actually are very excited about the opportunity to work more collaboratively together to fine-tune the delivery of post-secondary education in this province. And they are professional, they are bright, and they are committed to education. And I have faith that working alongside a caring government who values the importance of post-secondary education, we realize that that's going to be part of the solution of turning the economy or promoting the economy and growing it in Nova Scotia. So it's a good, healthy partnership, and it's going to work. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, this past October 12th to the 17th marked the 5th annual Halifax Housing Week. The week's events aim to inform the greater community about homelessness issues and the need for safe, accessible, and affordable housing. So my question to the Minister is: how much of the $128 million federal stimulus funding last spring went towards affordable housing units for the 1,718 individuals who stayed in shelters last year?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much for the question. And with respect to the housing stimulus, we have invested more money than has ever been invested in housing in this province for decades. We're able, through the partnership with the federal government, to put in that $128 million, and that money was focused on helping seniors, upgrading homes and affordable housing units, along with persons with disabilities. The issue with homelessness is a separate issue that we are dealing with. So thank you very much.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation believe in a 30% rule. They believe households have many demands on their income, including providing for basic needs like food, shelter, and clothing. In low-income households especially, the more spent on shelter, the less available for basic needs. But to be productive and a contributing member of society, people also need the financial means to be included in that society. Mr. Speaker, inclusion means access to social and economic activities and transportation to get there. So spending only on basics, having to make a choice between food and rent, reduces low-income households' ability to participate in the broader society. So my question to the minister is whether or not she and her government believe in this same policy that Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation believe, and if so, how come so many people on income assistance currently pay 50 to 60% on shelter?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware, as Minister of Community Services, the many issues that surround homelessness, surround persons living in poverty. And it was very unfortunate to come in and find that that whole area has been very neglected over the many years by previous governments. So therefore, we're doing catch-up, not in the first place. And I'm very proud that this government, we recognize that. So we are putting steps in place. For example, in our first year, investing $72 million in the affordable tax credit and also in the poverty reduction tax credit. Making changes also to the ESIA program that we have and making steps towards that. And that's what I'm very proud that we recognize it, and we're also working with the community and those people that we need to speak with. We are working with them to make a difference to go forward. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the federal stimulus money will soon run out, and the government's commitment to spending that money will end very shortly. So with that happening, and the federal government obviously not taking up a national housing strategy, I'm wondering when the money dries up what this minister's plan is over the next 2 to 3 years to provide affordable housing units for those folks that are so badly in need.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much for the question. The fact is that we do know that that money will be completed in 2011, and that's why we're going forward and discussing the strategy that we need in the province of Nova Scotia. And it is a strategy that we need everybody at the table. It is a strategy that will only work when we have community members, corporate members involved, along with municipal, provincial, and the federal government. And we have opened the door to those discussions. I've had people around my ministerial table to discuss it, and we do certainly plan to go forward and tackle the horrible issue of homelessness and the housing issue in the province of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is becoming increasingly clear that this government is all about controlling the message when it comes to gambling. This morning, at the insistence of the NDP caucus members, Sport Nova Scotia was used as a shield for the Gaming Corporation during Public Accounts Committee. Mr. Speaker, controlling the message is different than addressing the effects of problem gambling in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, would the minister responsible for the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation please explain how My Play system is of use for anything other than political cover, as it doesn't help responsible gambling?
The minister responsible for the Gaming Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a bit puzzled about the introduction to the question. The support for sport topic was one agreed on by all members of the Public Accounts Committee, which is chaired by a member of the Liberal caucus. So I'm just not sure what would cause the member to question that or make a partisan comment about it. In any event, Mr. Speaker, if the real question is about the My Play system, the My Play system is a system put in place by the previous government, a system that is now installed on every video lottery terminal in Nova Scotia. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the question of the effectiveness of that system is something that's very much under consideration by this government, as we see whether the investment made by the previous government was in fact a good and useful one.
The honourable member for Kings West on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the research on this system is unequivocal. This has no effect on high-risk or problem gamblers. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this My Play system isn't intended for much other than controlling a message. These cards are specifically targeted at those who already are responsible gamblers and are at no risk to develop a problem. Mr. Speaker, these cards don't seem like much of a tool for prevention or promotion. They don't seem to be much of anything except a win for TechLink, and it would take quite a leap of imagination or spin to believe otherwise. Mr. Speaker, given that the My Play system is only intended for those who are at absolutely no risk to develop a problem, Will the government be reconsidering the My Play system in their upcoming and quite late gaming strategy?
The Minister responsible for the Gaming Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question of the effectiveness of the My Play system is a good question. It's a real question. The member says that the research shows unequivocally that it doesn't work. I'm not familiar with that research, and perhaps the member could table the research that shows that. The research that I'm familiar with says that it does work, but as the member indicates, under limited circumstances. It doesn't work for everybody all the time. And of course, one of the key questions in front of us as we develop the gaming strategy is whether, in fact, the system would be more effective if it were made mandatory, or if we will continue the decision of the previous government that the system should be voluntary. It's a very good question. It's an important question as we try and deal with the issue of problem gambling and VLTs, and I look forward to getting a copy of the research to which the member refers.
The honourable member for Kings West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this gaming strategy was promised to Nova Scotians in time for Responsible Gaming Week back in October. The Minister said that it would be unveiled in time for the fall session so that we could debate this important issue on the floor of this House where it needs to be debated. But it's message control all over again. They suppressed the socioeconomic study on gambling. They use Sport Nova Scotia as a shield in committee. They're using delay tactics so they won't have to debate the tough issues on the floor. Mr. Speaker, will the government please tell Nova Scotians when exactly they will release their 5-year plan for gambling in Nova Scotia?
The honourable minister responsible for the Gaming Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issue of problem gambling is real. It has touched many, many Nova Scotia families, including my own family, Mr. Speaker. I understand how important it is. I also understand, Mr. Speaker, how important it is that we get the gaming strategy right, and we will take the time that is necessary to get it right rather than doing it fast.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this NDP government is not treating Nova Scotians equally. They've seen fit to give Cape Breton Rail more than $3 million to subsidize that service for another year. Yet, they canceled the Yarmouth ferry with no warning to the community, no consultation, and without providing any shred of evidence to support that decision. And to make matters worse, Mr. Speaker, no plan to support the region economically in the wake of that decision. When the people of Yarmouth were able to come up with half the cost needed to subsidize the service for another year, this issue wasn't even brought to Cabinet. My question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, why is this government not treating the regions of Nova Scotia equally?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'll say first, and I appreciate the question, and I would invite the member opposite, because I'm not going to have time during question period to elaborate on the difference between equal and fairness. What we do, Mr. Speaker, this government, we treat every region in the province of Nova Scotia fairly. But by that, Mr. Speaker, if we treat everyone equally, and if we treat everyone the same, we are in fact ignoring the differences of all the regions in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's one thing we do not want to do. And again, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate that I would invite the member opposite to sit down and have a conversation about how we do treat regions in the province of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Yarmouth and the people of southwestern Nova Scotia have been hurt. There's nothing fair and equal about that. Mr. Speaker, I've been hearing from many operators, tourism operators from across the region, not just Yarmouth, and they are understandably angry and disappointed with this NDP government. One operator wrote, "I run a restaurant in the historic district of Shelburne. I depend on tourism and was extremely upset with the minister when he canceled the ferry service with no warning to the industry. Furthermore, I contacted his office to see what their tourism plan was. They very openly admitted to having not a plan." End quote. My question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, what is being done to support the economy of southwestern Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I think there's a couple points that I want to point out. Number one is that we didn't, meaning this government, we didn't stop the ferry in Yarmouth. What we did is we said we weren't going to subsidize it anymore based on good reasons. Mr. Speaker, what we've done in southwest Nova Scotia is we've set up in partnership with the residents, with the businesses, with the federal government, we set up a committee down there to work with people and to work with the industry. We gave $400,000, Mr. Speaker. What we are trying to do with the cooperation of the people in Yarmouth area is we are trying to create a place for destination. No longer do we want Yarmouth to be a drive-through, or what we want, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of businesses, for the benefit of tourism in the area, is we want people to go there, to stay there, and enjoy what Yarmouth has to offer, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I've met with representatives from Team West, and they indicated to me there was one project working in southwestern Nova Scotia, a micro-environmental assessment to see if the region can grow cranberries. For the people that have been hurt in southwestern Nova Scotia, for the businesses that are struggling because of their decision to cut the ferry, and for the families that are trying to make ends meet, cranberries aren't enough, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I presented the facts to the minister. Operators and business owners are hurt by this government's decision. American visitations and tourism is down 40 to 100% in Yarmouth. Mr. Speaker, I have tabled a report detailing the cost-benefit analysis of the Yarmouth Ferry and economic impact of that ferry to the province, which saw that a $6 million investment in the Yarmouth Ferry would yield over $22 million of returns to Nova Scotia.
Question?
Will this minister right now commit to the people of Yarmouth in this province to help us secure ferry service for next year?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, what this minister and what this government has committed to Nova Scotians is to live within our means. We will consider anything and everything. Mr. Speaker, we've worked with the people of Yarmouth. We work with the people of Yarmouth. We have representation on that committee from Economic and Rural Development with the Department of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. Mr. Speaker, we are endeavoring, like we do in all regions of the province of Nova Scotia, make life better for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to do that.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education.
You got excited, Graham.
Education is critical for productivity in Nova Scotia. In fact, we need to align our Nova Scotian economy with the needs of China and India so we can supply their growing middle class with the things that they need. It will be difficult to compete with low-cost manufacturing in developing countries, but we can compete with knowledge-based product development and service. Affordable university education will help. To the Minister, how are we working with universities to reduce education costs for students?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I'm not in a position to talk in much detail about the various initiatives and the various levels of consultations and discussions that are going on with our post-secondary institutions and the various representatives. But it's a very healthy dialogue. They are very pleased to be consulted and to be involved in providing information and options and impacts, and that process will continue with the universities. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to hear that there is dialogue. Universities are free to operate independently from government, and they can set their own priorities, whether that be infrastructure or specialized studies. To the Minister, do you think that government has a responsibility when it funds universities to ensure that their business models do not lead to excessive tuition costs for students?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government believes that post-secondary students deserve the best education that we can give them. And the most effective way that we have to deliver on that promise is to make the most of the resources that we have as a province. So it's a very delicate balance. Nova Scotia invested nearly $450 million into universities last year. It's the second highest per capita funding in Canada. We have a strong, healthy, progressive university system, and our government is committed to ensuring that it stays healthy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is true that Nova Scotia puts a lot of money into our universities here. And I would also point out that a lot of efforts in the past have focused on tuition subsidies and tax credits. And these measures only reward the rapid rise in costs faced by students. What does the minister think? And I believe that the opposition has a duty to provide ideas in this legislature as well, Mr. Speaker. And my question to the minister is, what do you think about implementing a core university program, a funding program for universities that rewards universities for keeping costs down so that tuition is more affordable?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to presume that I can guess what the outcome of those consultations and discussions and decision-making will be. But we know it's a delicate balance for universities between the revenue they raise from tuition, the revenue that they raise through donors and supporters, and some of them actually have commercial enterprises. And the public funding that they receive from the government. And, you know, we understand that times are tough, and we want to ensure that that the right balance is there so that they can stay as strong as possible. Now, certainly, we will be looking at innovative approaches alongside, as you recognized in one of your earlier questions, the universities are independent organizations. They're governed by boards of governors, and they have top minds on these boards, top business people, top community volunteers. They have a lot of expertise to draw on. So we will wait for them to make suggestions and make their own decisions, and we will support them in that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin my questioning by reading a quote from the Minister of Tourism last week during question period. And I quote, "What we do is we plan for the future. For the first time in 2 decades, we have a government that not only has the strategy, but actually has the plan." End of quote. My question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, Mr. Speaker, is will you clearly outline your plan to this House to how to go about reviving tourism in southwest Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture.
I will say this, and that tourism in the province of Nova Scotia, generally speaking, we had an increase this year. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be able to stand here on my feet and take sole responsibility for that, but You know, Mr. Speaker, I've got to give kudos to the men and women that work in the department. They've worked hard. They worked hard to maintain and increase the level of tourism at a time when it's a difficult time. It's a difficult time right across Nova. It's a global difficult time. And despite all of that, with the hard work, the due diligence, is people have been working hard not to just maintain a certain level of tourism, but to increase it. And I can tell you this. Is that the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and the Minister of Tourism and Culture talk with one another on a constant basis.
The honourable member for Clare on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try another day trying to gather some information on that plan. However, I'll pursue in a different direction, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the loss of the Yarmouth Ferry, the economic development of southwest Nova Scotia has been hit hard. The Princess of Acadia is all that is left right now, and it's a vital transportation link between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The deadline for a decision on whether there will be a ferry between Digby and St. John has been extended until March 2011. Mr. Speaker, that's only 5 months from now. So again to the Minister, what discussions have you had with your counterparts in Ottawa, New Brunswick, and what response did you receive to ensure the ferry service will continue past March of 2011?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard a couple of questions there, and one is what response that we had from Ottawa was one question. So I don't know if you're allowed to, but I'll try to answer both of them. One, I will say this, Mr. Speaker, is that we are in a dialogue, we are in engagement, not only with Ottawa, but also with the province of New Brunswick. And as things become available and when we're ready, Mr. Speaker, and the second part of the question is, we are not ready to reveal anything at this point in time. We are in a process of negotiations, and when those negotiations are complete, the members in the opposite side of the House will know, the same as the colleagues here will know, and the general population will know, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. The honourable member for Clare on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Princess of Acadia has served the people of Nova Scotia well for nearly 40 years. The people of this area and the economic development of Nova Scotia depends on a new ferry for this region. So again to the Minister, will there be a replacement for the Princess of Acadia if your discussions with your counterparts are successful?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, the person answered, the member opposite asking the question answered his own question. And I reiterate, we are in discussions. Until those discussions are complete, I'm not about to stand here and say what could be. I don't have a crystal ball. When the discussions are complete, Mr. Speaker, everybody will know what the conclusions are. Until then, it would be inappropriate. It would be inappropriate for me or for anyone else to say what the ultimate conclusions from those discussions are going to be. Okay.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Community Services 2009-2010 Accountability Report has a ranking system for cooperative housing units. Level 1 and high level 2 units are deemed healthy. Low level 2 and 3 units are deemed to be unhealthy. My question to the Minister of Community Services: what is the total number of units deemed to be unhealthy in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much for that question, and I don't have those figures in front of me, but I will certainly bring them in and offer them to the honourable member.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate having that information. According to the Community Services Accountability Report, 30% of cooperative housing is deemed unhealthy. 20% of housing is deemed level 3, the lowest ranking. My question to the Minister of Community Services, why aren't maintenance issues addressed sooner?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing that question to me. What we need to do is we need to go forward and we need to be asking those type of questions, and that's exactly what I do as Minister as soon as somebody brings an issue forward to me. And one of the areas that I'm looking at is in particular with regards to the housing issues, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear there are many affordable housing units across the province that are indeed unhealthy. The department claims to be addressing this issue, but we don't know when or which units. So my final question...
Order. The time for oral question period has expired. I'll recognize the Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 73, the Forest Act?
Bill number 73, the Forest Act. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased on our Opposition Day to bring forward Bill 73, introduced on October the 29th this year, the Forest Act amended. And the bill requires the Minister of Natural Resources to determine and set an annual allowable harvest of forest land on Crown lands in our province. And this bill will protect Crown lands from over-harvesting. And I agree with the Minister when he opened up the rally on last Friday when he said, you know, we have one forest and in the province, and that is true because only about 25% of our land is protected or comes under the Crown, and 75% in private. But the bill would make the Minister of Natural Resources responsible for determining and setting the annual allowable harvest on Crown lands. The annual allowable cut is the amount of wood permitted to be harvested in the province within 1 year to ensure sustainability and productivity of our forests. Nova Scotians have made it clear that they want their forests to be protected. We've got that message loud and clear during the Phase 1 of the Natural Resources voluntary planning exercise, and ever since the report came out, Phase 2, we've also been hearing from many Nova Scotians. In fact, those who were at the rally last Friday, about 300, and a number of people who had the opportunity to speak, realized that really we were representing tens of thousands of Nova Scotians. The voice now and the message is being solidified, and that is give us the greatest degree of protection for this renewable resource. Government should lead by example and set a limit on harvesting on Crown land. We know that the practices over several generations have not been of the highest standard. They haven't really been the gold standard for making sure sustainability and best practices are used on a constant basis. To point out one example, we have the Chignecto Game Sanctuary, where within those lands, those Crown lands, we've permitted large tracts to be clear cut. So even in a game sanctuary, we haven't put forward the best practices. And our system has been one of demand as opposed to an allowable cut based on the amount of growth that we have in a given year. Now, there are more than 30,000 private woodlot owners in Nova Scotia, and many private woodlot owners are true environmentalists and stewards of the land. Again, we heard from them during the Phase 1 that went around the province. We've heard from them since the report came out, the Natural Balance report came out, and we heard again last Friday. And we'll continue to hear. In fact, in many ways, I feel that the small woodlot owner, the vast majority who have had good practices as fourth, fifth, and sixth generation Nova Scotians, making all or a good part of their living from the forest. They've in fact been the ones that government needs to take a look at, and in fact have been the drivers to make sure that we do right for the next generations of Nova Scotians. In Nova Scotia, forests cover over 4 million hectares, or it's about 75% of the province. These forests are diverse and productive resource, providing citizens of our province with environmental, economic, social, and cultural benefits. An Atlantic Provinces Economic Council study commissioned by FPANS in October 2005 concluded that Nova Scotia's forest industry generated about $650 million to the provincial GDP in that year, directly and indirectly employ about 11,000 Nova Scotians, and exported over $1 billion worth of products internationally. Including indirect effects on other industries, the forest industry accounts for an estimated 3.6% of the province's employment and GDP. Bill number 73 is an important measure and would assure Nova Scotians that public lands are being harvested in a sustainable way using the best science available. And that's the point at which we have heard, and we're hearing more and more, that the whole question of how we have practiced forestry in Nova Scotia, and especially as we practice it on a demand basis. When our pulp and paper mills, when our log mills, when all those operations are running at peak, and they haven't been in recent times, we heard, in fact, at Resource Committee from the Woodlot Owners Association of Nova Scotia that, in fact, there are peaks and there are valleys. There are years in which we overcut the replacement level in the province and hope we have a catch-up year. That indeed is not a best practice. Newfoundland and Labrador is one such province that already has an annual allowable cut in place to protect forest sustainability. We must start now to ensure our forests are properly maintained for our children and grandchildren. And it doesn't hurt, I think, to point out that there are 7 major forest industrial sites in Nova Scotia: Northern Pulp, Nova Scotia Limited Pictou, New Page, Port Hawkesbury, Minus Pulp and Power in Hansport, Bowater, Mersey, J.D. Irving and Truro, Englingna and Upper Musquodoboit. Now, one of the areas that we need to see in this province is the whole tree harvesting, and we are hoping, our caucus is hoping, and we're speaking for the majority of Nova Scotians, that we hope this practice does in fact come to an end. While Bill 73 is designed to take a look at the amount of harvesting, how we harvest as well in this province needs to be given very strong consideration. And we know that Applehead in Cumberland County is an unfortunate development, and whether something can still be done in that regard, we are not sure. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I'll now recognize the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wonder if you can tell me how much time I have, because it doesn't correlate with...
You have about 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the efforts of the member opposite, the member for Kings West. We have an annual allowable cut on Crown. For the time from 2006 to 2010, it was about a million cubic meters of softwood and 400,000 cubic meters of hardwood was the sustainable harvest on Crown. In 2008, according to the Registry of Buyers, we could have harvested 1.4 million cubic meters and only harvested 781,000 cubic meters, so a little over half of what was deemed to have been sustainable that year. The member raises some good points, I think some of which I would have to agree with them. I can tell them and the House, because I've been saying this, that there is going to be a reduction in clear cutting in this province, and there's going to be no whole tree harvesting. The member mentioned the Applehead property that the province bought last year, and this was raised in the rally last Friday. The province is limited, actually, that we can only buy by appraised value. So we had $9 million, actually, to try to buy that property at Applehead, about 8,500 acres. The company that owned it wanted 14 million, and we had 9 million. So there was quite a gap there to try to bridge. When finally through a fair bit of negotiation, the deal breaker was whether or not we could allow them to harvest part of it and get it for the $9 million, and that's what we agreed to do. It was a difference of I think $1.5 to $2 million in the difference by allowing them to harvest 2,000 acres, and 500 acres of that would be whole tree harvested, Mr. Speaker. And they have 2 years to do that. If they don't do it in 2 years, they don't do it. The member mentioned about Chignecto Game Sanctuary. I have to tell the member that the province's, the largest Crown allocation belongs with NewPage, and that's a historic long-term agreement, which over time, with negotiation, that agreement kind of changes a bit. But anyway, for other mills generally, I think Northern Pulp has about 200,000 acres of Crown. But generally other mills, sawmills in the province, the province really doesn't allocate more than 10% of what their harvest is. Whatever they show in the registry of buyers. One of the complications to that is the province is pretty well strapped with where it can allocate Crown land. We don't have a lot to offer to mills. They quite often come looking for more than the 10% of their harvest, but I got to say, most often we don't have it. We have some obligations to fill in the Ship Harbour Long Lake when that wilderness area was created. There's about 8,000 acres of harvestable timber was taken out of that allocation for Northern Pulp, and we have to find that to ensure that they get that volume. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, the member raises a good point, but the Crown has been doing an annual allowable cut on their land for some time, and has been moving for some period on doing harvests that are stand specific, which has really minimized the amount of clear cutting on Crown land, and tries to harvest those stands so that actually they harvest them as a treatment, and so that the stand actually will be better for the future. Mr. Speaker, I'm just one, two,
three.
Three? Oh, okay. Potato. Mr. Speaker, the member who introduced the debate raises a point that I would say that almost everybody, when they speak about forestry, they raise, and I don't think they intend to confuse the issues, but it always comes down to this. It's the volume we harvest and how we harvest. It's those two issues. The bill addresses purely an annual allowable cut, which is the amount that we harvest. And as I said, the province already watches that very closely and has applied an annual allowable cut on Crown land for some years. The issues around how we harvest is one, I think, that's probably uppermost in the minds of Nova Scotians. If you throw into the mix the term biomass, that has raised the ire of many people simply because they've seen photographs of large clear cuts of forests that were taken for biomass, even though the biomass was not for the new page NSPI project. It was biomass that's actually used in the pulping process. So anyway, that tends to, I think, confuse the public as to how biomass has to be harvested. It doesn't. There's no reason to assume that when you use the term biomass that you're always talking about electrical generation, number one, and there's no reason to assume that because it's biomass that you have to clear cut to get it, Mr. Speaker. And usually, I think in this province, biomass that's used for the pulping process is done with whole tree harvesting, and as I said earlier, we're going to bring that to a stop. What's generally referred to as the fines, the tops, the limbs, etc., that's going to stay on the forest floor for the nutrients that are necessary for the next generation of trees. And for all that we've done in improper forest practices in the province in the 21st century, we're not going to allow that to happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it gives me great privilege to rise this afternoon to make a few comments on Bill 73, the annual allowable cut Crown lands, and put forward by the honourable member from Kings West. We in our caucus actually are having a little difficulty figuring out just what the purpose is for bringing this bill forward and the legislature at this time. Mr. Speaker, we know that the Minister of Natural Resources will be bringing forward the government's new forestry strategy. He keeps on saying in a couple of days, and indeed I believe that he will, and I do question that a little bit too, because he still has a consultant that's out there working on the plan, so I would like to see the consultant finish his work before he brings forward his plan so that we can have a discussion based on fact rather than fiction. However, Mr. Speaker, while we may have some fairly solid guesses as to what might be in the strategy or the policy, we think it would be a good time to wait a few more days to see what the strategy contains and what, if any, legislation might be required to implement or, if we so feel as a House, to change it. It does not make any sense to discuss this single one-off amendment to the existing forestry legislation today when we know there will be a new policy that will demand a great deal of discussion from very shortly in this House of Assembly. Now, Mr. Speaker, the annual allowable cut issue has been a big subject of debate in Nova Scotia for some time. As a matter of fact, during the interval that I was not a member of this House, around the year 2000, I believe, the Department of Natural Resources was forced to discontinue the allowable annual cut on private woodlands because there was no mechanism really to keep count, although the federal government had demanded we try to do that. And yes, at that time there were some critics of the decision to abandon the annual allowable cut on private lands. But the progressive conservative government of the day felt that a better and more effective tool for measuring wood supply would be through wood supply analysis, which it has been using for the last number of years. This, the department figured, would be a good planning tool, and it has been. Mr. Speaker, although the annual allowable cut for private woodlands was abolished earlier this decade, The department maintained an annual allowable cut for Crown lands after that time. And as far as I can figure out, they still maintain it. In the most recent year for which records are available, 2008, the allowable annual cut on Nova Scotia Crown lands was 1 million cubic meters of softwood and 400,000 cubic meters of hardwood. That information from the National Forestry Database. The annual allowable cut on Crown land information is available from that source going back 20 years to 1990. So, Mr. Speaker, why on earth are we spending time in this House discussing whether or not the Minister of Natural Resources should be responsible for the annual allowable cut on Crown lands? Now, earlier this year, the Forestry Steering Panel that was part of the Natural Resources consultation the current government undertook recommended that a triad approach to Crown land management, and did indeed recommend the specific annual allowable cut on Crown lands continue. This panel also recommended an analysis of realistic management alternatives for Crown land. This whole woodlot management policy, Mr. Speaker, is a big deal throughout rural Nova Scotia. Make no mistake about it. The official opposition knows that, and I think that's why they're playing silly games in the House, trying to score points on one aspect of this whole issue. There are a whole bunch of issues tied up in the new Forestry Natural Resources strategy, a lot more than just the allowable cut matter. For instance, Mr. Speaker, what about the matter of defining what clear cutting is? The Minister of Natural Resources made some comments here yesterday in this chamber about what clear cutting was, but the clear cutting explanation was not that clear. And it is something that I think that still needs to be figured out, and something that we need to know precisely as we're moving forward with this legislation. Because if we're going to build a sound legislation, we need to know what indeed clear cutting is in the eyes and the minds of the people that manage our woods. Now, I hope when the strategy is unveiled and legislation implementing is introduced, we will really find out what the government intends to do on the whole issue, not just a single matter of annual allowable cuts on Crown land, important as that may be. At that time, too, Mr. Speaker, not only will we have time to study the government's ideas, but we will also be able to debate them here, and industry stakeholders will be able to come before the Law Amendments Committee of this House to make their views known clearly, once and for all. And then all the honourable members of this House will be able to listen, judge, and vote on the whole issue. So again, Mr. Speaker, it makes no sense to us right now to pass or even really debate legislation formally entrenching one specific aspect of forest management policy that will be addressed very shortly in the government's new strategy and accompanying legislation. Once we see and understand the strategy, we will be in a much better position to determine whether a bill like that proposed by the honourable member for Kings West makes sense. Right now, it does not. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, our caucus will not be supporting Bill number 73. Thank you very much.
Recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting listening to the member from the smaller third party that you know, he speaks as though this bill might actually pass today in advance of the forest strategy. And while that might be a very happy thing for many Nova Scotians, I don't think there's much risk of that, and therefore there is no problem, in my view, in bringing forth the bill that the official opposition, and especially the member for Kings West, has been talking about for a couple of years and waiting for the previous government and now this government to act on, and that just hasn't happened. There's a certain point where you give up waiting and you just take action, and that's what the member for Kings West has done. The fact of the matter is that it is extremely important that this one line be put into the Act governing forestry in our province. the fact that we would take the lead and set the total allowable cut on our own Crown lands not only establishes how much forest can be used and harvested for hardwood production and pulp and paper, but also for biomass. And the minister did mention biomass, and one of the things that prompts us to now come forward with this bill at this time, in advance, as the member has quite rightly pointed out, of the forest strategy, is that the energy regulations were released just a couple of weeks ago, which actually allow for 500,000 tons of forest biomass for the purpose of energy generation, still without a total allowable cut that would include other types of forestry. And so we feel that while there is no doubt room for biomass electrical generation in the province, the fact of the matter is that without having a total allowable cut in the province first, it makes no sense to set that limit. Mr. Speaker, this act does not actually set a limit, but requires the minister to set the limit, which allows him to use the information from the voluntary planning strategy to establish that. And perhaps that strategy and recommendations will come forward with such a measure included, and certainly we hope it does. And if it does, we'll be happy to support that. You know, I must give credit to the minister for something he said the other day at the rally outside the legislature. I had brought up the issue of Applehead and expressed my disappointment and the disappointment of many Nova Scotians that the province would buy land and then allow it to be clear-cut. I want to recognize the fact that the minister did stand up at that rally and acknowledged that he too was disappointed in that, and he understood that people were concerned about that. And I do want to say in this House that I think it takes a lot for the minister to get up and make that admission, and I appreciate it. I know the people there appreciated the fact that he was willing, you know, to point out the fact that even he was concerned about that. And there are things that we've heard that I know the member from Kings West is happy about hearing, such as the banning of whole tree harvesting, such as the reduction of clear cutting. And when we look at New Page, for example, in the biomass project in Cape Breton, they've already announced that they plan to reduce clear cutting by 50%. And that is the kind of thing that can be done where we actually have industry perhaps leading where the government should be going in that direction. Mr. Speaker, we do have to be concerned, though, because we've heard a lot, and we've heard this minister and other members of the current government talk a lot about the things that they're going to bring forward and talk a lot about the things that they believe in, that they believe very strongly, and then when the act comes forward or the legislation comes forward, it doesn't actually include those things. And so that's why we're concerned. Well, we hear the minister say that there'll be no whole tree harvesting, and we certainly hope that that will be the case, but we've heard things said before, and we watched Applehead happen with whole tree harvesting, and in fact, out there today, there is equipment on that site. I believe it was yesterday that work started on that site, clearing land that the province is going to buy. And, you know, the minister could today issue an order to stop that. And Mr. Speaker, the minister suggests he can't, but he could. He has that power to say, you know what, we've changed our mind, we're not going to allow that to be harvested. The government has found money to waste on other things and said that that was a priority, they could put the money there. Mr. Speaker, specific to this bill, the fact of the matter is that the reason why, Mr. Speaker, the reason why it is important to bring this bill forward now is because we cannot sit around waiting and waiting and waiting for the government to act. You know, we spent a lot of time doing that when the previous government was in power and nothing happened. And so now we don't want to make the same mistake waiting for things to happen with this government. And if the minister includes this sort of thing in legislation, we'll be happy to support it. We'll be very happy to support it. But the minister has talked about things like banning whole tree harvesting and reducing clear cutting for 2 sessions now, and we haven't seen anything come forward. So we are going to bring forward the ideas, and the fact that the third party would like to sit around and not take any action on issues because they hope the government will take action doesn't make any sense to me at all, Your Worship. We have, let me say that, and I said outside and I'll say in this House that there's many things we've heard the Minister of Natural Resources say that should they come forward, we're very supportive of. I know they mirror some of the things that the member of Kings West said, and if those things come forward, we will be there to support those actions by the minister because we think they're the right things to do. But we believe that the longer we wait on taking action on these issues, the worse it gets. And just the fact that the energy regulations came out in the province of Nova Scotia with 500,000 tons assigned to biomass with no science behind it to show, or at least none demonstrated to the public. We questioned that in the spring, and it was admitted at the time that there were no regulations. The media asked at the time the Minister of Energy whether there was science behind that to support that 500,000 tons. That concerns us, and that's why we feel it necessary to take action. And Mr. Speaker, I think that this bill is extremely important to have this debate on, and the fact that the third party would try and brush it off because it might suddenly pass today, I'm reasonably certain that the bill is not going to pass today. And so that is such a red herring in terms of being a fear. Boy, if it does, I just don't know. I really don't know. I can't even believe that the member from Cape Breton West even suggested that. Mr. Speaker, that member has been in this House long enough, and he's been a Speaker of the House, that he knows that there is a process and that it would be very easy for the government to know that this is an issue that we have, and would be very easy for the minister to include this should he deem it responsible to put in the forestry regulations that he will bring forward. Mr. Speaker, the fact is we do want to see this as part of the process, and we would love to see this passed, but I know there's a lot more people who would like to speak on this bill other than we will have time for today. So, and if the members and the third party had fewer resolutions, maybe we would have had more time to debate this today, but of course we don't. So the fact of the matter is,
Order. Member from Dartmouth East has the floor.
Why, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will close by saying that I know, Mr. Speaker, the member from Kings West and I have met with woodlot owners around the province. We have met with some of the industry involved in forestry around the province in various locations, and there is absolutely a problem. And this is an issue that has come forward time and time again from small woodlot owners, small forestry operators, large forestry operators, and it is something that we have heard across all sectors of the industry that is widely supported. The member from Kings West has brought this forward as a question repeatedly in this House to this and previous governments, and there hasn't been action. So there's a certain point where you have to take action yourself to try and make sure that it's included and is appropriately considered. And I have every faith that the minister will consider this in the recommendations. But this is something that's been talked about for a long time, and why, Mr. Speaker, would we even think about waiting another couple of days or another week or another 2 weeks? Because as the member from Cape Breton West said, the new forestry regulations have always been coming forward in another 2 days.
Speaker now recognizes the opposition House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 73, Bill number 77, the Tax Review 2010-11 Act.
Speaker now recognizes the honourable member from Clayton Park, Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to start the debate on this act, which is an act to call for a tax review in Nova Scotia. It actually is, just in brief, gives a lot of detail on a time frame for doing that. It calls for a report back to the legislature by April 29th, 2011. And it suggests that this should begin on or before December 15th, 2010. Mr. Speaker, well, as I go through the bill as presented, this is a Liberal bill. It's a bill that calls for a comprehensive look at the taxes that we pay here in Nova Scotia with an eye to the competitive competitiveness of our province and how we relate to other provinces around us and across Canada. And this is a theme that you've heard a lot of here in the House, Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years, and it's certainly gotten even more acute in the last year and a half since the NDP took government in this province. It has not gotten better. It's in fact gotten worse. The additional 2% that was added onto the HST has again eroded the competitiveness of Nova Scotia for all of us, for individuals purchasing things, for business to be competitive, and so on. Mr. Speaker, I think the need for this bill can be best accentuated by going through some of the quick facts about tax in Nova Scotia. And there are a number of different studies that point time and again to us being in if not the lowest third, the very bottom of the pack when we're compared to other Canadian jurisdictions. And you know, this is a situation that cannot be allowed to perpetuate and continue endlessly. People in Nova Scotia need to know that there's a plan, that there is an understanding of the full tax implications in the province. That's why we're talking about a comprehensive tax review, Mr. Speaker. It can't just be a single tax or picking away at one thing or another. We've got to look at the full tax burden on business, small business, and on corporations, and on the individuals living in this province. And Mr. Speaker, some of the facts are, and I want to begin actually with a quote from Donald Savoy in the report that he did called The Way Ahead for Nova Scotia. On page 10 of that report, it says, "I have long believed that a competitive tax regime is a powerful economic development instrument. Nova Scotia's tax structure is not competitive, at least compared to other provinces." And I mean, who else are we going to compare ourselves to except our neighbours and the rest of this country that we belong to? Mr. Speaker, we have the highest general corporate rate in the country here in Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia's small business tax is also too high, and we begin to collect it at an income level that's lower than our neighbours. So we're hitting small business at an income level below what would happen in our nearest provinces. We have our fourth and fifth highest tax brackets. Ours are the highest in the country. That means for our highest income earners, we're hitting them at a higher and more damaging rate than they are in other provinces. In fact, some other provinces don't have that fifth tax bracket, which was added when I was still the finance critic, and I remember it being added in a recent budget, not an NDP budget, I don't believe. It was a budget before that. But at any rate, we have the highest rates for our high income earners, which is a disincentive for people at the high end to live and work and contribute here in our province. You know, it goes without saying that affects our doctors, our recruitment of medical specialists, and others. So, you know, it just makes us uncompetitive in terms of attracting the best people to our province to help build this province up and make us more competitive in the long run. As I say, the 2 percentage point that we got on the HST this year has been a real hit to the province, and we have the highest HST in the country. Now, PEI has a slightly higher rate, but they're not in the HST regime. So other than that, we rank number one, and it is not a level or a ranking that we want to have, Mr. Speaker. I know the finance minister knows these figures, and I know that he's talked to the CFIB as well, who've done some very detailed studies across the country. They're a very effective lobby group on behalf of small business, and they have repeatedly called on government here in Nova Scotia to understand better the negative implications of this combined tax that from all quarters that are the highest in the country. You know, it's not just that we have the highest small business tax or that we have the highest property tax. It's all of them combined. So we're in a position where, you know, here in this legislature, we should be looking squarely at the facts, getting a complete picture of the taxes in this province, and I think we will be surprised when that is done. And I'm hopeful that at some point in time the government is doing that this bill, if not passed, would in fact be acted upon. Because I don't believe you can go forward unless you fully understand the picture before you, the actual current snapshot of where we're at in this province. And it is not a pretty picture. I'm going to go back for a minute to the CFIB, who scores all of the provinces on an index with regard to taxes. The overall ranking that the CFIB found that Nova Scotia was the third worst province in the country based on our provincial tax regime. And a quote from their study says, Nova Scotia has the second worst score on property and capital tax and is in the bottom 3 on corporate income tax. You know, I would venture to say, Mr. Speaker, that when you roll all that together, you know, we're right at the bottom in terms of this country. We know in terms of corporate tax, and all of us would agree that we need some of the larger corporations that provide a lot of employment, although small business, you know, collectively is the biggest employer in the country, and here in our province as well. We need those big employers, the Michelins, the power plants, the you know, the paper companies that employ a lot of people. And in terms of how we tax them, Mr. Speaker, you know, there is a gap that widens as you go up in terms of income, but you know, at the rate, if they earn $1.5 million, the gap between us and the Canadian average is $30,000 extra paid in taxes. Mr. Speaker, other provinces, including the federal government, have plans to lower income taxes by 2014. I'll just name them. BC, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick are 4 that have said they will lower their corporate income tax by that date, 2014. Nova Scotia has no plan, and we don't have the review and the understanding of the total picture of our tax burden. And Mr. Speaker, this bill would address that need. I think there is a crying need for us to move forward on it, and I hope to hear from the government side and from our colleagues in the third party that there is support for this kind of a venture, because, as I said, Mr. Speaker, it is long overdue and needed in this province. I believe my time has expired, or not quite. Well, you have to tell me if I have more time. I could just carry on.
No, your time is expired. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will turn it over to the others. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. I will recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the truisms of government, Mr. Speaker, that nobody likes paying taxes, but everybody loves the services that those taxes pay for. And it's always a mistake, Mr. Speaker, to talk about one without the other. It is a mistake to talk about taxes in isolation without talking about the fact that the money raised from taxes pays for schools and the teachers in them. It pays for hospitals and medical centers and the nurses and the medical technicians and technologists in them. It pays for roads. It pays, in short, for all the things that the members of our communities, our constituents, our families, ourselves expect from our provincial government. Mr. Speaker, it's also a mistake to go the other way, which is to talk about the services that people want without talking about where the money is going to come from to pay for it. And we've had a good long time of Liberal and Conservative government where that simple question was not addressed, Mr. Speaker. Our commitment as a government is to be different from Liberals and Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, to deliver quality health care and education that people need, and to do it while living within our means. Any government, Mr. Speaker, and I would suggest any opposition party, has to answer a couple of questions when they're talking about revenue. The first question, Mr. Speaker, is what is the total revenue requirement that is needed to deliver the services that Nova Scotians expect and need? And then the second question, Mr. Speaker, once that is fixed, is from what tax base will it come? Who is it who is going to pay for that revenue requirement? So let me look at those two things in turn, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the total revenue requirement. The main things that the government of Nova Scotia provides to its citizens, of course, are health care, education, community services, and roads. Now, together with debt payments, Mr. Speaker, I should say interest payments on the debt, that is $8.5 billion of the $9 billion budget. Those are the things, those are the services that the government of Nova Scotia provides to its people. Now, the question of how much service and what level of service is an iterative process back and forth. You don't just say, well, here's what we're going to do, and we'll find the money however much it takes. We'll find the money somewhere. It's a back and forth process trying to find the balance between the services that people want and need and the money required to pay for it. The second question, Mr. Speaker, once the government hits on its total revenue requirement, is where will the money come from? Now, Mr. Speaker, in our budget, the largest source of revenue, largest single source of revenue is actually the federal government. And of all of our revenue, it provides $2.9 billion of revenue. $2.9 billion comes from all federal sources. Now, Mr. Speaker, all of us, I think, would like to increase that amount because that means any money coming from the federal government is spread over the entire national tax base, so we get a large benefit at a very small cost to our own citizens. But I think we all recognize, and everybody who has been in government recognizes, like the member for Cape Breton North, who spent a good deal of his time as Minister of Energy trying to increase that amount that we get from the federal government, and did a very good job at it, may I say. Did a very good job of it. Mr. Speaker, I think we all recognize that there is a limit to how much the federal government is willing and able to transfer through the provincial government. Among provincial sources, Mr. Speaker, the largest single source is provincial income tax at $1.9 billion, followed by HST at $1.4 billion. And Mr. Speaker, those are by far the two largest sources of revenue. Every other provincial source of revenue is much, much smaller than those two items. And the significance of that I'll get back to in just a minute. Total provincial own source revenue, $4.7 billion, and that leaves the Liquor Corporation, the Gaming Corporation, with revenue to the province of $348 million. That's where our revenue comes from. Now, Mr. Speaker, if there is going to be some form of tax review, it has to start with a framework. And here's the essential thing about that, Mr. Speaker, is the Liberals, by proposing something called a comprehensive tax review, are dodging the really hard questions. They're simply hiding behind this bill. Every question to do with government services and revenue, they don't know what the answers are. They just say, we'll do a comprehensive tax review, and hope that everybody reads into that whatever they want to hear. Now, Mr. Speaker, the key question in any review of taxes is the tax review supposed to result in greater revenue, the same revenue, or lower revenue? Now, let's assume that none of us wants to further increase the government's revenue. That's our commitment through the back to balance process. That's the commitment that we made in the last provincial budget. So if the purpose of the tax review is to raise the same amount of money, Mr. Speaker, then the real question is, who is going to pay more? Because if the total tax take is the same, the total revenue is the same, if somebody pays less, somebody else has to pay more. And that's the really difficult question, Mr. Speaker, and the Liberals refuse to address that question. Who do they think ought to pay more than they're paying right now? Who do they think ought to pay less, Mr. Speaker? That's the tough question, and they completely evade it. But if the purpose of the tax review, Mr. Speaker, is to produce less revenue, which appears to be implied in the news release of the Leader of the Opposition, then they have to answer a different question, which is, what services to the people of the province would they cut? That's the real question, Mr. Speaker. We're trying to take the services and fit it within the total revenue available to us, but they say, the Leader of the Opposition says in the news release, he's going to further cut the revenue. But, Mr. Speaker, that money pays the wages of nurses and teachers. It pays roads, Mr. Speaker. It pays for social assistance. It pays for housing. What is it that the Liberals would cut? You know what, Mr. Speaker? They refuse to say. So by advocating something called a comprehensive tax review, all the Liberals are doing, Mr. Speaker, is completely avoiding any of the difficult political questions that face any of us in government. Mr. Speaker, we don't have to look very far to see what Liberal economics looks like. Let's look next door in the province of New Brunswick. They did a tax review, Mr. Speaker, but they only picked the bits that cut revenue, not the bits at the back of the report that increase revenue. And what happened, Mr. Speaker? Well, Mr. Speaker, there are certain rules of economics. If you cut your revenue is going to go down. So the province of New Brunswick is running a massive deficit that the new government has to deal with. That's the bit of the equation the Liberals leave out because they refuse to deal with the real issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the impetus for the introduction of this legislation is no doubt due to the decisions of the NDP government. Over $1 billion in debt, Mr. Speaker, since they came to office. Increased taxes. Failure for government to live within its means. They're making life more expensive for Nova Scotians. Now, when Dr. John Ham gave Nova Scotians their first balanced budget in 2002, NDP members who are still sitting in this House today they were vehemently opposed to it, and they voted against those budgets. Imagine where we would be today, Mr. Speaker, if we did not have the foresight of our former Premier Ham to start putting this province back on course after 40 years of deficit budgets. We do agree with the Liberals on the point that the people of our province pay too much tax. But unless government starts to live within its means, we don't really have much choice but to endure high taxes. Now, there was reference made to the CFIB study and the lack of competitiveness in our Nova Scotian economy. And I took a look at the numbers in that study, Mr. Speaker. And the thing that struck me the most is that we have a small section of our economy that's entrepreneurial. Now, one of the reasons for that, I believe, is because of our high taxes. And no doubt, if we do have high taxes, it's going to be harder for that sector of the economy to grow. Why do we have high taxes? I would say, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps our government has grown too big over the years. That needs to be addressed. A government needs to match its expenses with its revenues. It's as simple as that. Now, in today's difficult times, there are many needs demanding the attention of government. And we in this House do not see the merit in passing legislation to do another study. The Progressive Conservative government, before 2009, had commenced such a review, so I don't see why we would need to start the process all over again. The government can make use of the work that was completed by senior servants in the Department of Finance before the change of government, and I expect most of the information that is the intent of this bill would be available to the department. The issue here, Mr. Speaker, is not more study, but action. And with respect to the Liberal caucus over on this side of the House, we need to balance the budget as soon as we can, and we need to move towards a future of lower taxes. And we should remember that the budget was balanced for 8 straight years before this NDP government came to power. So, Mr. Speaker, to do this extra work, it's really comes down to busy work, and I don't think it really helps to provide a vision for the future of our province. It doesn't start to solve the problems. And as our new leader on the weekend just passed, when he was made leader of our party, he agreed with the Honourable Minister and acknowledged it, that we want the government to come back to balanced budgets. But we only wish that the NDP hadn't brought us there in the first place. So, Mr. Speaker, we do need more competitive tax structure in this province. But we must balance the budget first. If we look to New Brunswick, and my honourable colleague raised it here today already, if we look under the Graham Liberal government, the debt in New Brunswick grew from $6.7 billion in 2006 to $8.3 billion. And we note that they were going to try to sell NB Power to Hydro-Quebec. One of the challenges with selling a utility that a province owns is we can see how quickly a government can come to power and waste that money in overspending. And we've seen it here with the money that was put down on the royalties in this province, the prudent decision by the Progressive Conservative government of the day to put down royalties on the debt, and now, within a year, that debt has been wrung right back up by this NDP government. So, Mr. Speaker, if we wanted to look at the taxes that we do have, I would give a quick review right now. 40% of our taxes come from the federal government. That's outside of our controls. That's almost half of our taxes. And the nice thing about them is that they're legislated to grow. Health care is legislated to grow by 6%. The social transfers that we receive by 3%. Together, they make up about 12% of our revenues. We have another 17% of our revenues from federal equalization, and that's grown by 2% over the past year. We have lost some on royalties, but that is completely out of our control. It's dependent on the industry. Our income tax is the biggest generator for the province, and that's at about 21%. And the other taxes, corporate taxes brings in about 4% of revenues, HST brings in about 14%, and there are various other measures that would equal the remainder. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't really see that there's much the government can do around tax. In the future, I hope that we can reduce it. But right now, we have to get to work to balance the budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable member. I'll now recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to join the debate. I first of all want to respond to the Minister of Finance's suggestion that the Liberals don't have any solutions to our challenges in front of us. I can tell the honourable member the one thing that I know since standing in this House, that I did not walk out in front of Nova Scotians during the general election and tell them one thing and then come in here and do something different like you did. Mr. Speaker, we as a party, and I believe all members of this House, recognize that as a province we are becoming uncompetitive. All of us, I'm sure many members of this House had an opportunity to campaign in the by-election in Cumberland South where the new Conservative leader was elected to represent them. And doorstep after doorstep, the issue of cross-border shopping, the fact that jobs were being lost, and it kept coming up that we were in an uncompetitive environment. And you know, the simple solution, as was presented in the election campaign, was we'd create a new zone around gas taxes. Well, Mr. Speaker, that was a silly notion, and we all know that. The challenge facing our economy is much greater than that, and it needs to have a long-term view on how we settle it. I listened to the member from Inverness who talked about the great glory days more recently. Well, Mr. Speaker, the total revenue in the province of Nova Scotia in terms of covering all those expenses around 1999 was around $5 billion. We've grown to almost $9. We've grown to almost $9, and I would dare say that Nova Scotians are not better off today in terms of health care services. We've got challenges around education. The school boards are being asked to cut up to 20%. Are we better off? How come? It's because the way government has done business in the past, Mr. Speaker. Any revenue that they've received, they spent. And that's what happened through really the 90s. It was a real missed through the 2000s. It was a real missed opportunity. There's no question there was challenges by all parties, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are looking for something new. But reaching out and looking at an uncompetitive tax environment prior to the last election, then coming into power and increasing the HST by 2%, creating another tax bracket, giving members of this House a tax break, while low-income Nova Scotians hadn't received any, was short-sighted, Mr. Speaker. What we've asked for is that as a legislature, we look at a comprehensive review. What is the unintended consequences to our economy of that 2% HST increase? We've talked an awful lot about government services. How are we going to grow the private sector in an environment that's uncompetitive? Mr. Speaker, this is not the province of my parents. My children will have an opportunity, as everyone's children in this House will, and every Nova Scotians are very mobile, and they'll move. They'll move to an environment where they're going to be treated properly, where they can grow a business, create a life and environment for their children. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't work anymore to say we're a beautiful place so everyone's going to stay. Every province boasts of that. The challenge for the government and us as an opposition is to create an environment where the entrepreneurs of this province can grow it. Mr. Speaker, what are we doing for the Nova Scotians who are creating the jobs today? We're doing very little. We're doing very little. This government continued the same practice as previous governments, except they increased the Industrial Expansion Fund to funnel money out the back door where it's not being viewed whether it's a good investment in the economy, whether it's going to continue to grow jobs. What we're asking for is to have everything reviewed with an eye on not the next election, but 10 years out, 15 years out. What does our province look like? Can we create the kind of environment where the men and women who've stood through the tough times in this province for generations, who've created the jobs for generations, will have an opportunity to continue to do that and allow their children to do it here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance, who got up and talked about more political rhetoric than any substance around talking about how we're going to move our province forward, never suggested or never said to the people of Nova Scotia what increase in HST has done, just presented him with more revenue. He's doing exactly what every finance minister has done long before him. What's new and what's different? What's new and what's different, Mr. Speaker, is we are falling farther behind as a province and as an economy. What we're asking for in this review is to look at which tax can we change that would create economic opportunity and would allow to grow our economy in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting if you go back and you talk about what happened under Dr. Ham when we increased the motor fuel tax by 2 cents a litre. It was supposed to fix all the highway challenges in the province. Mr. Speaker, I dare say in Pictou West you have a few roads that still aren't paved. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians were inflicted with a 10% tax increase under the John Ham government following the 2003 election campaign, Mr. Speaker. What has that done to our economy? What this government is doing and continues to do is to look at our tax system as a cash cow and where can I make a quick grab to increase my revenue, as opposed to making, quite frankly, to the Minister of Finance, some of the tough decisions. How do we deliver those services? Will there be cuts required? Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance all Nova Scotians would like to know if the cuts are going to come in the emergency rooms around our province. Is that where they're going to find the revenue? Mr. Speaker, if you look at what the economic panel had suggested to this province, there were 3 things that they could do to grow the economy. They could, or to bring it back to balance, sorry, they could cut services, increase taxes, or grow the economy to create jobs and economic opportunities for Nova Scotians. As I'm hearing one of the members say you can't do all 3, well, I disagree with them. I disagree with them. And it is government's responsibility, to create an environment where we can grow the private sector. Mr. Speaker, what is the increase in the HST done to grow the private sector? Nothing, Mr. Speaker. What is creating a 5th tax bracket for the very professionals that we're having challenges to keep in our province? What is it done to help us solve those challenges? It hasn't done anything, Mr. Speaker. It has made the problem worse. What we're suggesting is that the government should look at and engage Nova Scotians in a review on what happens if we reduce the small business tax. What would happen? How much revenue loss would we receive, but how much growth would we have in our economy from one end of Nova Scotia to the other, Mr. Speaker? How much? No one seems to have the answer. The place has gone silent, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the real challenge, Mr. Speaker, we are an uncompetitive tax environment. The only thing that's going to get us out of the challenges we're facing today is if we grow the private sector. If we grow the private sector to allow the men and women who are creating the jobs in Nova Scotia to flourish and work here, Mr. Speaker. We cannot continue to rely on government to continue to bloat the bureaucracy of Nova Scotia and somehow think that's going to create economic opportunity that will allow us to grow. Who's going to pay for that bureaucracy? Where's the new revenue source? Where's the new money coming from, Mr. Speaker? I would suggest by doing a comprehensive tax review, we could look at the tax system where we could make changes that would create those economic opportunities for Nova Scotians and the men and women who have continued to invest in this province, to grow their businesses, to hire your children and mine so that they stay here in the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member or opposition House Leader.
Speaker, the discussion on Bill 77, the timetable for that discussion was Liberal 540 to 548, and then we were going to adjourn. It's not 548. It's only 546. And the reason is the third party didn't use up all their time.
That's correct.
And that's permitted. They're permitted to do that.
Yes.
If they want. We stood up and we took their time because it was time for us to, it was our turn to get up and speak. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm saying to you that the time frame here should be followed. We were supposed to speak to 548,
that's fine.
and you're about to give the government a second crack at this this resolution. I saw the member over there stand up, going to speak.
If
to this
the honourable member wishes to speak on this topic, or any member of the party, go ahead.
Pardon me?
You may speak on the.
I am speaking on it. I'm speaking on the point of order.
Great.
The member from Cape
And I'm
Breton
allowing
South
you to continue on Bill 77.
Well, look, you know what? I will continue on Bill 77 if that's okay with the chair. I can tell you one of the things that I will follow up on.
The
on
honourable
my
government House Leader, I'll recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, it's not their turn if the member sat down. But indeed, I can tell you from the government's caucus, it would, if you so wish it, we would support the leader of the opposition to finish if he has time.
That's fine, and that's what I'm allowing the opposition party to do. So if the honourable member, the official opposition, the honourable member for Cape Breton South may
certainly like to have half an hour to speak on the particular topic that our leader was so succinct in talking about the problems of the government and what they're doing with the budget, but I don't have that kind of time. No. And it is now, I believe, 5:48.
If you wish a couple extra minutes,
I
by all means.
No, what I want to do, what I want, Mr. Speaker, is for you to follow the rules of the House, and the rules of the House state the 5:48. That's what I want. Okay. You know. And I don't know who made the deal that the government could get up and take up the extra couple of minutes, but I certainly wasn't going to sit back and let that happen.
I'm allowing you a couple extra minutes if you wish.
No.
Okay.
The time has expired. Okay. You know that.
The time has expired. I'll recognize the Honourable Government House Leader for tomorrow's business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, the hours of the House tomorrow will be from 2 a.m. to 2 p.m. Make it work for it, Mr. Speaker. 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. and the bills for second reading will be Public Utilities Act, Securities Act, Oak Island Treasure Act, and the moratorium 82, the moratorium on Georges Bank.
Do you have the numbers of those
numbers
bills?
Again, 78, 79, 81, 82. I apologize for that, Mr. Speaker. So I wish you do not rise to sit at the hours between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. tomorrow.
Okay, the motion is to adjourn till tomorrow at 2 p.m. Are you ready for the question? Question's been called. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The hour has arrived for the late debate under Rule 5.5, and I'll read it. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of the House of Assembly join me in honouring those who serve in our Canadian Armed Forces, past and present, their families and loved ones, for the dedication, loyalty, and perseverance they exhibit in protecting Canada and preserving democracy and peace throughout the world. And that was submitted by the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville. And I'll now recognize the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today on this very important topic, especially since the Remembrance Day is coming up shortly, and I believe Veterans Week begins on November the 5th. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I know that there's a guest who is supposed to arrive here. He was supposed to be here at 5:45. Unfortunately, he's not here as of yet because this gentleman has served in our Canadian Forces for many, many years, and he lives in one of the communities that I represent of Hammonds Plains. Mr. Speaker, this gentleman by the name of Sergeant Kevin Byrne, he's from Sydney, Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and a good Cape Bretoner from, I know that the member for Cape Breton Nova is very proud of fellow Cape Bretoners. But Mr. Speaker, this gentleman is a dedicated member of our Canadian Forces. Mr. Speaker, he has served for 31 years, Mr. Speaker, and has traveled This member of the Canadian Forces has traveled to many various missions across the world, and including Israel, Mr. Speaker, Syria, and most recently in Afghanistan with Task Force Freedom. Mr. Speaker, this soldier, he retired in 2001, in February of 2001, after serving 28 years, and returned to the forces in January 2007. And Mr. Speaker, I think that just shows the dedication that he as an individual has for his country and for his province and for his community that he comes from. Mr. Speaker, in the resolution that we talked about today, it states that as members of this House, that we honor those who serve and have served in the Canadian military, both past and present, their families and loved ones, for the dedication, loyalty, and perseverance that they exhibit protecting not only our country, but other countries around the world, Mr. Speaker. And we, as legislators, as 52 people who sit in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for our military and the Canadian forces who served in the past and for the present, we would not be here today. And Mr. Speaker, I have met many constituents of mine who have come, who I've met through door knocking, have come to my office, who have really shown their perseverance and dedication to their country, because they show me their appreciation for the things that I do. And the member from Queens, her brother is in Afghanistan, a warrant officer in Afghanistan right now, and we are certainly proud of the work that he does. Mr. Speaker, the reason why I brought this subject forward, Mr. Speaker, is that in October of 23rd, 2009, the then Master Corporal Byrne contacted my office, as we all do, looking for pins and flags. At that time, I didn't know that he was in the forces, but he came to my office. It's a common request for us all to receive them, to receive these types of requests. However, Sergeant Byrne had requested these items to bring along with him on his upcoming tour to Afghanistan, that he would fly this Nova Scotia flag proudly in his quarters and display patriotism for his province. And I said, absolutely. Mr. Speaker, this Sergeant Byrne, handed out to people in many different countries, from France, England, Scotland, the US, Afghanistan, Australia, New Zealand, and that's just to name a few, Mr. Speaker. The two flags were well traveled, Mr. Speaker. One flag is signed by members of the Canadian Helicopter Force in Afghanistan and was actually carried on board on one of Sergeant Byrne's Halo's missions. The second flag was carried with Sergeant Byrne when he traveled on leave, and he carried the flag to England, Scotland, Wales, and France. He had the opportunity to visit Normandy with his son and follow some of the footsteps of the North Nova Highlanders. The flag was with us, with them every step of the way, and he also paid a visit to Vimy Ridge. Sergeant Byrne has since given the flag to the young Griffin pilot, also from Nova Scotia, who carried the signed Nova Scotia flag with him during the missions. His intent was to return one of those flags, Mr. Speaker, to the government of Nova Scotia and to this legislature, and has since presented the flag to me in this House a couple of weeks ago. A great honor, Mr. Speaker, that over 50 pilots, 50 people in the Air Force had signed this flag and presented it to me. It was quite an honor, Mr. Speaker. With that flag was a signed certificate from the commanding officer stating that this is a certified flag flown in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, we all know, every single one of us have legions in our constituencies that play an important role in the life of veterans. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are coming to November the 11th, another year, believe it or not, another year of supporting our veterans and supporting our current members of the armed forces. The Royal Canadian Legion Calais Branch 162 in Lower Sackville is the local branch for Sergeant Byrne, and has been a valuable resource for both him and the other 1,500 active members of the branch. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that before next week, I'm going to have this flag folded properly, contained into a shadow box, and on Remembrance Day, with the permission of Sergeant Byrne, I will be presenting this flag to the Royal Canadian Legion. Because, Mr. Speaker, it certainly was an honor for me to receive that flag, but, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the proper place for that flag is to be at the local Legion, where Legionnaires can see it every day when they visit there. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly proud to have received that honor from Sergeant Byrne. And, Mr. Speaker, it's quite unfortunate that he isn't here to hear it. I know he said he was going to try his best to be here for 5:45, but unfortunately he isn't. But, Mr. Speaker, the other group of people that I want to thank are the families. Are the families of former personnel in our military, as well as the people who are serving today. Because, Mr. Speaker, as legislators, we know that our families sometimes are left behind. We are here in Halifax, Mr. Speaker, and yes, we get to go home on weekends. Some of our members travel from Cape Breton down to Yarmouth. Luckily, Mr. Speaker, I get to go home every night and see my family, my new wife. But, Mr. Speaker, some people don't get to see that. God bless her, exactly. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, the 6 months or 9 months or a year that members of the armed forces do not see their family is unfortunate. And, Mr. Speaker, without the support of their wives, their brothers and their sisters and their cousins, Mr. Speaker, they couldn't do it. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to those families for everything that they do, the wives and the husbands, the daughters and sons. And, Mr. Speaker, I do see Sergeant Byrne coming in, and Sergeant Byrne, I have 2 minutes to talk. Sergeant Byrne, I have 2 minutes to talk, and I've already done my spiel about how wonderful you are and the 31 years you've served in our military, and I want to personally thank you and your family for everything that you have done for our nation, for our province, and for our community. We are truly proud of you, and I know that you and your wife that your wife is proud of you and your family. And, Mr. Speaker, I know for a fact that those medals that he wears there today represent the type of person that Sergeant Byrne is. And we thank you so much for your service and the service of your family. Because, Mr. Speaker and Sergeant Byrne, I just spoke about all of the things that you have done in your career to better the lives of not only the country you serve, the province you serve, the community you serve, but the nations around the world, that because of the efforts of you and your comrades, you have made this world a better place for all. So thank you very much.